Few places in recorded human history have punched so far above their weight as this small, rain-soaked archipelago sitting at the cold edge of the North Atlantic Ocean. A cluster of islands so modest in size that you could fit the entire landmass of the United Kingdom into the state of Oregon, and yet from these rocky shores, a civilization rose that would conquer a quarter of the Earth's surface, reshape the map of every continent, build the world's most dominant navy, spark the Industrial Revolution, and give birth to a language now spoken by over 1.5 billion people. This is not just a country. This is a civilization forged in fire, invasion, plague, war, revolution, and empire. And then, somehow, stubbornly, magnificently, it survived all of it. This is not the story of kings and queens alone. This is the story of an island that refused to stay small, of a people who were conquered again and again, and each time emerged with a more powerful identity, of an empire that spanned the globe, then collapsed, and of a nation still wrestling with what it means today. From the first Roman legions crossing the English Channel to the coronation of King Charles III, this is 2,000 years of the British story, compressed into one epic journey. And it begins not with glory, but with survival. If there is one word that defines the British story above all others, one thread running from the ancient Iron Age hill forts to the modern halls of Westminster, that word is resilience. The British Isles have been invaded by Romans, Angles, Saxons, Vikings, and Normans. They have been torn apart by civil wars, shattered by plague, humiliated by revolution, and bankrupted by world wars. What you are about to witness is not just a political timeline, it is the psychological biography of a civilization that discovered its identity not in moments of peace, but in moments of crisis. And those crises, as you will see, never truly stopped. The islands that would one day become the United Kingdom were home to some of the most sophisticated prehistoric peoples in the ancient world. Around 8000 BC, as the last ice age retreated, hunter-gatherers crossed from continental Europe over what was then a land bridge, a flat, marshy plain connecting Britain to modern-day France and the Netherlands. This land, sometimes called Doggerland, eventually flooded beneath the rising North Sea, turning Britain into an island for the first time. That geographic isolation would prove destiny-shaping. By 3000 BC, Neolithic farmers had arrived, clearing forests, raising cattle, and, most remarkably, constructing some of the most awe-inspiring monuments the ancient world has ever seen. Stonehenge, on the Salisbury Plain in southern England, was not built in a day or a generation. By the time Julius Caesar arrived to scout the island in 55 BC, Britain was a mosaic of tribes, the Iceni in the east, the Brigantes in the north, the Cativellauni in the south, each fiercely independent, each deeply suspicious of outsiders. Caesar tested them, skirmished with them, and then left. But Rome would not be so easily deterred. It was already calculating. In 43 AD, the Emperor Claudius launched what Caesar had only dared to probe. 4 Roman legions, approximately 40,000 men, crossed the Channel and landed on the southeast coast of Britain. It was the most significant military invasion the island had ever seen. The resistance was fierce. The Cativellauni, King Caradocus, fought the Romans for years, retreating westward into Wales, inspiring tribe after tribe to resist. But Rome was patient and methodical. By 50 AD, the south of England had been pacified, and a new city, Londinium, was being built along the banks of the Thames. It would one day become London. But perhaps the most dramatic moment of the Roman occupation came not from Rome itself, but from a British queen. In 60 AD, Boudica, ruler of the Iceni tribe, led a massive revolt after Roman officials seized her lands and humiliated her family. Her army burned Camulodunum, modern Colchester, to the ground. Then she marched on Londinium and destroyed it completely. An estimated 70,000 Romans and their allies were slaughtered in the uprising. The Romans stayed for nearly 400 years. They built roads that still underlie modern highways. They introduced the concept of cities, of law, of written administration, Latin fused with local dialects. Christianity arrived. And then, as the Roman Empire itself began to fracture and collapse under the pressure of barbarian invasions across Europe, Rome simply withdrew its legions in 410 AD. Britain was left alone and exposed. The century after Rome's departure is sometimes called the Dark Ages, not because nothing happened, but because the written records nearly disappeared. Into the vacuum left by Rome, waves of Germanic tribes arrived from continental Europe. The Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes. They came first as raiders, then as settlers, then as rulers. The Romano-British population was pushed westward into Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany. A new cultural layer was laid down over the old. But then came the Vikings. From the late 8th century onward, Norse raiders struck the British coastline with terrifying speed and violence. Lindisfarne, the sacred island monastery off the northeast coast, was sacked in 793 AD, a date historians often mark as the beginning of the Viking Age in Britain. Within decades, the Danes had conquered much of England, establishing their own territories in what became known as the Danelaw. Into this crisis stepped Alfred the Great of Wessex, perhaps the most consequential ruler England had ever produced. Forced to hide in the Somerset marshes in 878 AD, seemingly defeated, Alfred rebuilt his forces and struck back. He defeated the Danes at the Battle of Edington, negotiated a treaty that divided England, promoted literacy, codified laws, and began a systematic rebuilding of the English kingdom. His grandson Athelstan would, in 1927 AD, become the first ruler to claim the title King of all England. A nation, fragile, bruised, but real, had been born. But this was not the end of conquest. In 1066, one of the most consequential years in all of English, and indeed world history, a crisis of succession changed the island forever. When King Edward the Confessor died without an heir, 3 men claimed the English throne. Harold Godwinson, the powerful English earl, seized the crown. Harold Hardrada of Norway invaded from the north, and William, Duke of Normandy, cousin of Edward, descended from Viking settlers who had themselves conquered northern France, invaded from the south. Harold defeated and killed Harold Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire. Then, exhausted, he force-marched his army south. On October 14, 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, Harold Godwinson was killed, tradition says by an arrow through the eye. The last Anglo-Saxon king of England fell. William the Conqueror was crowned on Christmas Day 1066 in Westminster Abbey, in the same building where British monarchs are crowned to this day. The Norman conquest was not a simple regime change. It was a cultural earthquake. French became the language of the court, the law, the nobility. Latin remained the language of the church, and Old English was pushed down into the peasant class, where it mixed with Norman French to eventually produce the most widely spoken language on earth, modern English. Even today, the English language bears the scar of 1066. Pig is the Anglo-Saxon word. Pork is the Norman French one. Cow is Anglo-Saxon. Beef is Norman. The poor raised the animals. The rich ate them. That distinction survives in our vocabulary to this day. The Norman kings built an extraordinarily centralized feudal state, but it did not go unchallenged. The tension between royal power and aristocratic rights would define the next 2 centuries and produce one of the most important documents in the history of human freedom. In 1215, a group of rebellious barons forced King John, probably the most despised king in English history, to sign the Magna Carta at Runnymede, a meadow beside the Thames. This document, radical for its time, established that even the king was subject to the law. It guaranteed due process, limited arbitrary imprisonment, and protected the rights of free men. It was not a democracy. Most people were not free men, but it planted a seed that would grow over centuries into constitutional government, parliamentary democracy, and eventually the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The idea that power must be limited by law, that idea was born, in large part, in that meadow by the Thames. The 14th century brought catastrophe. In 1348, the Black Death arrived in England, a bubonic plague so devastating it killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population in just 3 years. Villages were abandoned. Social hierarchies were overturned. The peasantry, now scarce and in demand, began demanding wages and rights. The feudal system, which had defined English society for centuries, began slowly to crack. Out of the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal dynastic struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York that ravaged England for decades, emerged a new royal dynasty that would transform England from a minor European kingdom into a nascent world power. Henry VII established the Tudor dynasty in 1485. But it was his son, Henry VIII, who truly changed everything, and not only because of his 6 wives, though that story is dramatic enough on its own. In 1534, in a dispute with Rome over his desire to annul his first marriage, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. With a single act of political will, he broke England away from the Roman Catholic Church, dissolved the monasteries, seized their vast wealth, and set in motion a Protestant Reformation that would reshape the religious and cultural identity of the nation permanently. Elizabethan England also gave the world William Shakespeare, whose 37 plays and 154 sonnets would define the English language and human storytelling for all time. That England, at this precise moment, produced the greatest writer in the history of the language is not a coincidence. A confident, outward-looking civilization was giving voice to its own complexity. The 17th century tore England apart and rebuilt it into something unprecedented in world history, which had been growing in power and confidence for centuries, disagreed. The conflict escalated into outright civil war. Between 1642 and 1651, royalists and parliamentarians fought a series of bloody battles across England. King Charles was captured, tried for treason against his own people, and beheaded in 1649. It was the first time in history that a reigning monarch had been publicly executed by the legal authority of his own government. The world was stunned. In 1688, the Glorious Revolution removed the Catholic King James II without a single battle, replacing him with the Protestant William of Orange, who accepted a Bill of Rights that permanently transferred real power to Parliament. By the early 18th century, Britain had something no other major nation on earth possessed: a functioning constitutional monarchy with a representative legislature, an independent judiciary, and a tradition of free press. These were not gifts from above. They were rights won through centuries of conflict, negotiation, and, when necessary, revolution. The 18th century unleashed British energy onto the world with extraordinary force. The Act of Union in 1707 formally merged England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain, creating a larger, more powerful state. The Royal Navy became the undisputed master of the seas, and from ports in Bristol, Liverpool, and London, British merchants, soldiers, and settlers began building the largest empire in human history. India, the jewel in the crown, was gradually brought under British control, first through the East India Company and then directly by the Crown. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, large swaths of West Africa, the Caribbean, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Egypt, vast territories in East Africa. At its peak in the early 20th century, the British Empire covered 13.7 million square miles, roughly a quarter of the Earth's total land area. It contained over 400 million people. It was, by any measure, the largest empire the world had ever seen. And yet, and this is the uncomfortable complexity of history, it was also the empire that eventually abolished the slave trade in 1807, that developed legal systems still in use today, that built railways, universities, and infrastructure across the globe, and that, under enormous pressure from both domestic abolitionists and enslaved peoples themselves, was forced to confront its own contradictions. Empire is never simple, and Britain's is no exception. At home in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a revolution of a different kind was underway, one that would change human civilization even more profoundly than any military conquest. The Industrial Revolution, born in the mills and coal mines of northern England, transformed manufacturing, transportation, and the very nature of human labor. Steam power, railways, iron and steel, mechanized weaving, inventions born in Britain spread across the world and launched the modern economic era. By 1850, Britain was producing more than half of the world's iron and coal, and its GDP per capita was the highest on Earth. The 20th century began with Britain at the apex of global power, and ended with the empire in ruins. The two world wars were the hinge on which everything turned. In 1914, Britain entered the First World War, the Great War, against Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The optimism with which the war began collapsed almost immediately into the grinding horror of trench warfare. By 1918, over 700,000 British soldiers had been killed. An entire generation was lost. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, themselves soldiers, recorded the devastation in verse that still breaks the heart. The war ended in Allied victory, but victory felt hollow. The old world, confident, imperial, certain of its own superiority, was shattered forever. 20 years later, Britain faced an even greater test. On September 3rd, 1939, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain announced that Britain was at war with Nazi Germany. Winston Churchill, who replaced Chamberlain in May 1940, faced a situation of almost incomprehensible danger. France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had been miraculously evacuated from Dunkirk, but without its equipment. Hitler's armies controlled most of Western Europe. Britain stood alone. The war ended in 1945 with Allied victory, but the cost had been devastating. Britain was economically exhausted, its global credibility was damaged, and the colonies that had fought and died for the empire were no longer willing to accept its rule. The age of empire was ending. Between 1945 and 1970, the British Empire essentially dissolved, one of the most rapid imperial retreats in history. India and Pakistan gained independence in 1947. Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Malaya, the Caribbean colonies, one by one, the flags of the empire were lowered. By the 1970s, the empire that had once covered a quarter of the earth was reduced to a handful of scattered territories. Britain responded to this dramatic contraction by reinventing itself. The post-war Labour government created the National Health Service in 1948, a system of universal free health care that remains, despite all its challenges, one of the proudest achievements in British social history. The welfare state was built. A new social contract was forged between the government and its people. The late 20th century brought its own upheavals. The Troubles in Northern Ireland, a brutal 3-decade conflict between Republican and Loyalist paramilitaries, and the British Army, claimed over 3,500 lives before the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, offered a fragile, precious peace. The Falklands War of 1982 briefly revived imperial nostalgia. The end of the Cold War redrew the global map. And Britain, under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and then Tony Blair, navigated a complex path between American alliance, European integration, and its own turbulent internal politics. The 21st century has been, for Britain, a period of profound uncertainty and extraordinary resilience. In June 2016, the United Kingdom voted in a referendum to leave the European Union, the most divisive political decision the country had made in decades. Brexit, as it became known, split the nation almost precisely in half. It exposed deep fractures between generations, between London and the regions, between England and Scotland, between cosmopolitan and traditionalist visions of what Britain should be. 3 years of political paralysis followed. 3 prime ministers resigned or were removed. Parliament deadlocked. And then, finally, in January 2020, Britain formally left the European Union, ending nearly 5 decades of membership. The COVID-19 pandemic struck in 2020, killing over 200,000 people in the United Kingdom and triggering the largest peacetime economic contraction in history. And yet, the National Health Service held. The vaccine rollout Britain conducted was one of the fastest and most successful in the world. In the darkest moments of the lockdown, people across Britain stood on their doorsteps every Thursday evening to clap for the NHS workers risking their lives on the front lines. It was, in its quiet way, a very British form of resilience. In September 2022, Queen Elizabeth II, who had reigned for 70 years, longer than any monarch in British history, died at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. Her death was mourned not just in Britain, but across the world. She had been, for many people, a fixed point of stability in a century of extraordinary change. Hundreds of thousands of people queued for miles through the streets of London to pay their respects as her coffin lay in state in Westminster Hall. King Charles III, the first coronation to explicitly include voices from non-Christian faiths, the first to take place in a Britain transformed by decades of immigration and cultural change. Charles, who has spent decades advocating for environmental protection, now leads a nation grappling with climate change, with the legacy of empire, with questions of racial justice, and with the fundamental question of what Britain means in the 21st century. And so we return to where we began, a small, rain-soaked archipelago at the cold edge of the North Atlantic. An island that should, by any rational calculation, have remained a minor player in the great theater of world history. Instead, it gave the world a legal tradition, a language, an industrial revolution, a democratic model, and an empire whose consequences, both glorious and catastrophic, are still being felt in every corner of the earth. The British story is not a story of unbroken triumph. It is a story of survival, of being invaded and recovering, of being torn by civil war and rebuilding, of building an empire and then dismantling it, of losing a world role and then searching, sometimes painfully, for a new one. That thread, that stubborn, irrepressible capacity for survival and reinvention, runs from Stonehenge to the Houses of Parliament, from Boudica to Churchill, from Magna Carta to the National Health Service, from the Elizabethan voyagers who first mapped the world to the young, diverse, complicated nation that is finding its footing in the 21st century. Britain today faces questions it has never faced before. What does sovereignty mean in an interconnected world? How does a nation reckon honestly with the crimes of its empire? What is the future of the union between England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland? How does a post-imperial people forge a new identity from the extraordinary diversity it has accumulated? But these are not questions of decline. These are questions of reinvention. And reinvention, as 2,000 years of history have shown us, is something the British are very, very good at. The story of the United Kingdom is not over. It is still being written in the debates of Parliament, in the streets of its great multicultural cities, in the decisions of its new king, and in the lives of the millions of people who carry this history for better and worse wherever they go. From Roman Britain to King Charles III, this is the island that refused to stay small, and whatever comes next, it will not go quietly into history. This civilization never has.